All right, welcome back to Recovery Sort of. As always, this is Jason. I'm a guy in long-term recovery, and I am here with
Billy. I'm also a person in long-term recovery.
And today we have a wonderful special guest named Daniel.
Hey guys, yeah, thanks for having me. I'm a former heroin addict, so great to be on the show and talk with you.
I was curious how you were going to introduce yourself there. I know not everybody believes in either recovery or recovered or any of that specific language. It's interesting how everybody's got their own way. So
I'm sure I'll change it at some point too. I'm not locked into that. Whatever. Yeah, it's all good.
That's funny. We always tend to say between Billy and I that like whatever it is we believe now, just give us 5 years and we'll probably tell you some other shit.
100%. Yeah.
And so Daniel's here today. He's from Smart Recovery. And, you know, while no one person should ever represent a recovery modality, we are going to put him on the spot and ask him to anyway. Just for
Sounds good. Sounds good.
And so the best thing we've heard, while we do have a ton of questions to learn more about Smart Recovery, I think the best thing we've learned is that it's always good to just kind of start with, why don't you tell me about Smart Recovery before we ask questions?
Right. No, good place to start. So Smart basically I'll tell you what it stands for: self-management and recovery training. And the essence of Smart is that they see addiction as a learned behavior. They are based primarily on cognitive behavioral therapy. So their focus is primarily just like, let's center in on ideas and techniques that can help you change from a self-destructive life, one that you're probably unhappy in, to one that is constructive and satisfying. And a key takeaway or a key thing that most people notice and discover right at the beginning of their Smart journey is that we don't focus on labels or use labels like addict or alcoholic. We actually encourage people to not use those kinds of labels. And Smart's principles are entirely based on scientifically validated methods, which are really designed to empower you. So we're all about self-empowerment and developing a more positive lifestyle, whatever that may look like for you.
And so, if you don't mind, you want to tell us just a shortened version of your story? I believe you told us that, you know, your story is a little relevant for why Smart seemed like the better choice for you.
Yeah, let's see if I can do a condensed version that kind of everyone says that, right? Like, it's like, okay, give us the life story in 5 minutes, please. So I was actually raised in a fairly conservative Christian family. And so my upbringing was, I would consider it fairly sheltered. I was not exposed to things like substance use or a lot of alcohol consumption or anything like that. It was maybe a little on the extreme side in terms of the sheltering and the fundamental kind of moral focus that I grew up with. And in my late teens, as a result of some really what I would later reflect on as being traumatic experiences, some things that happened both within my family and also within the church that I was a part of, I kind of just said, there seems to be something foundationally wrong here with the way I understand the world, the way I understand God as he was taught to me as a young person, and with my entire belief structure as it's built, because it seems to me, at least, that the people, the adults, the ones I trusted, the authority figures that were presenting the truth of the world to me, were hypocrites and were misleading me and were not really telling me the honest truth. Now, were they really? I mean, or how much of that is the youthful mind not really able to understand reality in the world, and I'm growing and learning. But in any case, my reaction was very intense. It was kind of like, I'm turning my back completely on this way of life. The moral sheltering that I grew up under, I'm going to push back against that. So like, the sky's the limit. Let's explore. And I basically went from being a sober individual who had never used or experimented with any drugs or alcohol to clubbing and smoking weed and drinking every day within a matter of a couple of weeks to a month. Like, it was a very rapid transition. And one of the things that I look back on in in kind of retrospect, I understand that one of the things that I interpreted about the way God existed in the world was that he was there to make you feel good. That was my understanding as a young person. When you're feeling bad, when you're depressed, when life's not going well, you pray to God and he will make you feel better. That's a very fundamental, kind of immature, childish understanding of the spirit world, I suppose. But it actually had the counterproductive effect of priming me for substance use, I think. I think that in a sense, I understood God like he was a drug, right? You take a drug to feel better. You can use God to feel better about your life. Like I really had no good foundation for understanding greater spiritual truths or understanding the faith of the Bible as it was taught to me. It was very elementary school. And as a young person, I think most people that grow up in a religious framework, they do go through some sort of crisis of faith at some point in time. Like you can only ride your parents' belief system for so long, and then you really do have to develop your own, right? So maybe part of that journey was a necessary part in order to come to my own understanding of faith. But as a result, in my early years in addiction, when I was first introduced to the 12 steps, the spiritual components of the 12 steps were something I was highly resistant to, because I obviously had arrived at a place in my life where I was like, I don't want God to be a part of the solution for me. I really was like, no. I can figure this out on my own. Like I felt that I screwed my life up. And so I needed to take responsibility for it myself and then kind of find my own way out of that. And then you meet all types. I have only my experience to go by in terms of my experience with NA and AA and the 12 steps. Like I can't compare the meetings that I attended to ones that take place anywhere else in the world. But some of these early experiences, I met people that had very strange spiritual beliefs and their higher power, their concept of a higher power was so foreign to me, or so illogical, really, like, because I'm a very analytical, logically, that's how my mind works. Like, even though I do still I have a faith today, and it's based in my own journey that I came to from moving away from what my parents taught me in kind of a fundamental framework. The illogical version of spirituality that I saw certain individuals presenting about what their concept of a higher power was, to me, it was like, this is just ass backwards. Like, this makes no sense. How can the bottle of beer that you don't drink in your fridge be your higher power? Like, that was one story that I remember hearing at a young, early 20s, impressionable age, where these people are my example for recovery. And this is kind of from the front of the room what they're hearing. So maybe I had some really early bad experiences, but for whatever reason, it kind of primed me with a distaste for the 12 steps, which was very hard to shake. And then a couple other things that just did not resonate with me based on my personality. Like, I really believe recovery is a lot about personality, and that as we grow, we have more opportunity to become self-aware and get to know ourselves, get to know how we work. I highly encourage people to do personality tests, to do things like the Strengths Finder and the Big Five, like the Ocean Personality Profile and Myers-Briggs. And no one of those personality profiles tells you who you are. Like, that's not what their intention is, but they do reveal things about you that are valuable. And so as I got older, I was able to figure out more about my personality and realize, oh, this is a reason smart recovery and cognitive behavioral therapy clicks for me, and why NA and the 12 steps didn't really click for me. Some of it is my analytical mind, my thirst for knowledge, my need for scientific evidence to be underneath what I believe. And so that makes it a challenge for the faith element, right? You can't put science underneath all of that all the time. And that's a bit of a learning curve. And it's a wrestling match. Like, I'm literally wrestling with that all the time still in my day-to-day life. But I remember hearing people introducing themselves as, I'm so-and-so, I'm an addict. And hearing that saying, that kind of cliche, the once an addict, always an addict. And I think maybe I didn't really understand it in my youth, but seeing people that were 5 or 10 or 20 years sober and still at these meetings calling themselves an addict didn't make sense to me. That's really what it came down to. It was like, wait, I thought you're sober for like 10 years. You don't use drugs anymore. You don't have that as a part of your lifestyle. Like, how are you still an addict? That was the reasoning that was going on in my mind. Now I can look at it in a different perspective. Now I can see this is a person who was probably felt empowered by that label. They probably were attempting to prevent themselves from becoming complacent and to stay motivated in their recovery journey. They didn't want to forget how dark and bad it was. So that label, in a sense, is something that can keep them grounded in preventing them from going back, right? But for me, it felt like a hopeless thing. For me, it was like, oh, this is like, I had no framework for addiction yet. I'm 21 and I loved using drugs and they were a lot of fun and partying was great, but problems are developing and relationships are being affected and it's affecting my work. So it seems that I can't totally walk this, drugs every day and booze every day and a functional life very effectively, right? And so I was coming to that realization. Part of it I came to in the back of a police car, but like you do, right? But and then I'm hearing that, oh, if you step out of denial and admit that what's really going on for you is an addiction, you will have to carry this label around with you for the rest of your life. And to me, that was such a hopeless idea that I was just immediately from day one, I was like resistant to that. I'm like, I'm not taking this label on. And so part of that was denial, I think. And there was an element of that, which I had people around me like, no, you need to come to terms with your behavior. Like, you are a drug addict. You can't deny that. Right. And it's like, okay, yes, that is true. I do see how my behavior is classic drug addicted behavior. I can't deny that. But at the same time, I see this label as being a harmful thing that's not inspiring hope for my journey or for my future. So it was a real wrestling match. And that was kind of, sorry, a very long answer to your question. But that's a little bit of my personality and I think why I was primed for finding something that was an alternative to the 12 steps.
It's interesting. I think there's definitely been times in my recovery where I've heard about people who had problems with 12-step fundamental issues with, whether it was we called ourselves addicts forever, or maybe they just had a really terrible experience early on with somebody in their version of a higher power. And I know there's been times in my recovery where I've kind of judged that idea and been like, well, you just need to get the fuck over it and get on with life and learn recovery, obviously. But I'm almost wondering now, the more I learn about these other modalities, it's like, you know what? Maybe you could have got over that and you could have worked a 12-step program and maybe that would have worked. Possibly. Who the fuck knows, right? But the awesome thing is, it's great that there's these other places that you can have a resentment against NA and go to these other places and still find help. Isn't that better? Like, why would I judge that, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we need to have, recovery is a journey, and anyone that's struggled with an addiction and then finds themselves kind of on the recovery road knows this, right? It's not a straight line. Right. There is a lot of up and downs. I think our families are all like, oh, it's a relief. He finally went to treatment. Everything's going to be great now, right? And obviously, it's not that way. I mean, I can't even count how many detoxes I went to or how many times I was in treatment centers and things like that. So it's a journey. And one of the ways I look at that journey actually for myself is like this really volatile stock. If you take a look at a stock that's super volatile, it's up and down on any given, the US dollar is a good example. On any given day, you never know what direction it's going to go a little bit, right? But if you zoom way out and look at the last 30 years, that even though there's a lot of ups and downs in it, it's been trending up the whole time. And so that's kind of how I see my recovery journey too, is like, I had a lot of ups and downs. I had a lot of lapses. I really felt I almost say that my recovery was defined by relapse for a long period of time because I just had so many. And yet if I look back at it now, removed from it and out of it, I can see that even in those those low points and when you bottom out and you relapse, I was trending in one direction. And that trend line really started to go way up when I learned to look at relapses as a learning experience as opposed to just a failure. And that was something that SMART really helped me with because, again, just through the way my mind operates and the way I interpreted the NA modality, like I suffered, I think most people in addiction can relate to feelings of shame and guilt, right? And
yes.
like that's super common. So and mitigate, like, guilt is valuable. It's not a bad thing. We shouldn't be running away from our guilt, but shame is harmful. And shame is something that we don't want to encourage, and that we really want people to begin to see their value and to not wallow and live in shame. And for me, I had so much overwhelming shame as a result of my behavior because I did not like the life I was living. I was not happy with the direction it was going in. I did not feel I was living up to the potential that was within me. That when a lapse happened, the idea of needing to get that just for today fob again was it so compounded the shame that I felt about myself as a failure, because that was my belief structure, right? I believed I was a failure, that I just couldn't bring myself to go to that point because it felt like a restart. It felt like in a sense it's day one, but NA really kind of emphasizes like you're at day one. I mean, I felt there was an overemphasis on counting days sober and a lack of emphasis on what is the quality of your life. Like if someone's had 10 years of sobriety and their life is amazing, they've got a family and children and a successful career, and then for whatever reason something goes sideways and they have a lapse, maybe that lasts a day or a week or even a month, but they pull themselves out of it. That 10 years of recovery is not a write-off. And perhaps they stopped themselves from going too far and they got back on track. And we need to find a way for them to learn from that experience and identify the things that went wrong that led up to that, because it probably wasn't a 1-second decision. It probably wasn't a bad day that they decided to use drugs all of a sudden. I think it was probably a culmination of things. Studies show that most relapses are like 2 or 3 months in the working before they culminate in actually picking up the substance. So, SMART really emphasizes learning experience, like what can you learn from this and what went on, why did you relapse? And I really want to focus in on that for individuals so that we can just get away from the whole shame story and the narrative around shame. And I don't think that's an intentional creation of NA. Like I don't think they intentionally are like, we got to make people feel as shameful as possible about the behavior. I just think it's a side effect that is perhaps just inherent to some extent in the way that system is created around the fobs and the celebration of sobriety. Sobriety is the thing to celebrate for sure. And I just never put it up here on my value list in terms of like needing to count my days. I don't even know precisely right now. Like it's not something that is the most meaningful thing to me. For some people it is. So again, I'm always qualifying my statements because I don't want to offend people and say my way's better. It's not what I mean it by any means, right? I'm just saying, like, again, this was how my brain processed this stuff. And so I'm a unique person. We got to help unique individuals find their unique path, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, I don't know. We're going to offend people along the way. I'm with you. I try not to offend people too, but I know I do. Couple of interesting points in there, just the shame thing and the celebrating sobriety and how important is that versus how good my life is on a daily basis, like which one holds the importance and the relevance. I think all that's super relevant for my life and things that I think about. I think one of the only times I think clean time does come into play in my head is when I'm trying to like when I have an argument with somebody who has less and my ego is trying to use it to prove me right. It's like, oh, he's only got 3 years over there. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
That is actually a really key point, because I felt like we do emphasize, it's like we offer a little more credibility to people based on how long they've been sober. And so you guys didn't ask, but if you had asked me, I wouldn't have answered you. And I actually do that intentionally. It's just a decision I made along the way, because I really don't want to. I don't want people who were like myself to feel shame for having less days sober. I just, like, if you've only got one day, if you're just starting, like, you're still valuable, and your life has tremendous meaning and value, and it's fine. Like, and what you have to offer and the knowledge and the wisdom you have isn't any less than someone who has 5 or 10 years sober necessarily, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have something to offer yet. And so I just decided, I'm in long-term recovery. It's been a while, and I don't need to, like, broadcast that, because I don't want to make anyone feel like they're not valuable for where they're at in their journey.
That's super interesting. So if somebody asked, I will definitely, like, tell them how long I've been in recovery or clean or whatever you'd like to call it. But I generally don't ever say it when I share about it either. And it's a different reason for me. It's just more of a humility thing. It's like, it's really not that relevant. Like, how am I living today? Because I can have whatever amount of clean time and go home and fucking smack my kid across the mouth and be a huge jerk. And I'm like, that's really useless to have clean time for that. Like, that's not how I want to live.
Yeah. Are you improving your life? Like, is who you are as a person improving on a day-to-day basis? And those things are far more important than the number of days you've had sober, right? Yeah.
No, absolutely. You kind of made you made smart recovery sound like the Planet Fitness of recovery modalities to me, with, like, the judgment-free zone or something.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that it's that in writing, it's perfect in that sense. But, I mean, it is facilitated by human beings. So I'm quite certain that we don't escape all critical attitudes and judgments.
Smart needs a lunk alarm.
Yeah. We do make a strong effort to just accept people where they're at. And Smart's primary focus is on abstinence, but they're willing to bring people along that aren't there yet. So they will take a harm reduction approach to things. They will encourage. Now, if you're coming to a meeting and you're not sober, that's going to be a problem. We're not gonna be, like, going down that road. But we are, plenty of people are navigating their recovery journey. Some people who are feeling like maybe they want to reduce the harms of their harder drug use, and they're going to just smoke some cannabis on occasion, and they'd still be welcome. I mean, I think they'd still be welcome in a 12-step meeting too. It's not like you would tell them to leave, but because we don't have the entire system or any emphasis around counting days sober or celebrating that or handing out fobs, it's just not part of the meetings. It's just not part of the space, right? Like, so people do talk about that. They do have conversations about their sobriety. I've met people that have come that were drinking a lot and they just want to reduce, as opposed to being completely abstinent. I mean, that was me for a time. I really, really tried hard to be a social, responsible drinker. Like, I really wanted to be. And then through about a period of 8 years of attempting that, and I realized it was not working out multiple times. I was like, okay, I give up. I can't drink. It doesn't work for me, right? But some people need to go on that journey. They need to figure that out, right? So let's have grace for them in the process. Like, if they haven't come to a place of accepting that abstinence is what they need for them, then that's okay. Maybe they will get there. Maybe we can, have some compassion in the process, right?
Super interesting. Just to check off some of these as you're answering them, you did say what SMART says that addiction is, which is a learned behavior, and I would say, I guess, a learned behavior with a negative consequence, or how?
Oh, yeah, clearly. Like, I mean, substances are useful. I think that's something that we can acknowledge. Addictive behaviors serve a purpose. They will help people cope with life problems and emotional difficulties and whatnot. But clearly, for anyone that's been using substances for a while and they're developing problems, like there's negative consequences, right? And I think the focus really needs to be on helping an individual find out what's underneath the substance use. So what kind of pain and things in life were the substances helping them with?
Right.
Like, let's be honest about it. It wasn't, at some point it went away from just being a party and being fun to serving a purpose that dealt with the pain and trauma and emotional upsets in some way. And we need to identify what those things are. So you need to acknowledge that it served a purpose. So when we say learned behavior, SMART doesn't really take a position on disease theory. They're open, like people can subscribe to disease theory or not. There's a lot of, like, in the work I do, there's a lot of opinions on addiction theory. I mean, disease theory obviously stands out as kind of the definitive, the de facto. It's in the DSM-5 right now, basically, like addiction as a disease. When we use the terminology learned behavior, the emphasis, I think, in SMART is on personal responsibility. So if I can give you an analogy about choice, because the word choice comes into the addiction quite often, like people talk about addiction, is it a choice? And then people who have been in addiction will often say, well, obviously it's not a choice. You didn't choose to be addicted. It's not a choice. I think it's really hard to use a simple word like choice to explain a complicated idea like addiction. And the best analogy that I've heard is to look at a tug of war for an individual that is in addiction, as if they're in a tug of war. And you have one side that's pulling them into their addiction, to stay in it, to stay addicted. And those things that are pulling them in that direction might include their childhood trauma, the difficult circumstances of their life, the destroyed relationships and burned bridges that they're in, the fact that they're actually physically and psychologically dependent on a drug, so they don't want to go into withdrawal. All those kinds of things, their financial situation, are pulling them to stay, right? It's tough. It's easier to just escape and get out of this by these feelings by numbing out and disconnecting, right? And the other side of the tug of war is the things that are pulling that individual to a better life. So the hope that they have for their future, the people that see potential within them, the family and loved ones that support and surround them and are encouraging them and trying to give them hope and support them in the process. And so is there a choice in this? Yes, I think there is. But for many, and for myself too, for many years in addiction, this side was just pulling. It was loaded, right? There's 10 big strong guys pulling this way, and there wasn't much pulling this way at all. So we need to load up on supports for individuals. We need to give them more hope. We need to not be condemning and shaming them. We need to have compassion and empathy for where they're at. We need to be able to connect them with healthy support systems and models of recovery that work for them and that they resonate with. So that's kind of the way I see addiction working in an individual. That choice plays a role, but it's not that reductive.
Yeah, I personally avoid the conversation about whether it's a disease or not at all costs. Mostly because, honestly, at this point, like the most beneficial thing that came out of the disease model is the fact that insurance covers it. And if we ever lose that, I don't. What the fuck are we going to do then, right? So, like, let's just act like we don't care.
Well, 100 years ago, I mean, we operated strictly on the moral model. So if you're addicted, you are a reprobate sinner who needs to repent. You are bad. Drugs are bad. You need to stop using drugs. And so we've come a long way. from there, obviously. And I think the disease model is a necessary part of our evolution and the understanding, the way we as a society understand addiction, because of one of the key points you mentioned. It has allowed us to acknowledge addiction as a health issue. Yeah. Rather than a moral failing, rather than, you're just weak-willed, rather than just, it's just the drugs. You just got to stop the drugs, like as if the drugs are what caused the addiction. We've moved into, understanding this is a health issue. We need health supports for these individuals. And we really need to take that a step further in our society, because while we're treating as a health issue, we're also still criminalizing people for their addictions. And that's a real problem, because that further disconnects them from the support system that might actually help them break free.
Yes, absolutely. Try to get us back to SMART. I know I always enjoy the conversation so much. I get off topic. Are there any qualifications for membership in SMART?
None at all. No qualifications for membership. SMART doesn't really have a membership. In the sense of like the people that attend meetings. There's no formal requirements to come, or we don't collect names, phone numbers. We do it as anonymously as possible. We don't even need people to use their real names when they attend meetings. No membership. There is some training for facilitators, of course. And so that's a bit of a different story, but anyone could become a facilitator if they wanted to, and they can get onto smartrecovery.org and find out what that process looks like.
Right. Awesome. What about somebody who necessarily, maybe they never used a drug, and then they just show up at your meeting? Can they benefit from it? Are they allowed to stay?
Yeah, they can stay, and it does happen, mostly in the context of family supporting an individual. So we'll often have a young person come with a mom or a dad, or a loved one come with like a spouse, and they don't understand addiction, but they want to support their loved one. And so they'll participate by all means. There's also, SMART acknowledges behavior and process addictions too, as equally as potentially destructive. So people may not be dealing with substance use disorders. They may be dealing with gambling or sex addiction or shopping or any kind of process addiction, Netflix and chill too much. So, people need to, are welcome by all means. Yeah. By all means.
Excellent. So this is kind of a loaded question that I don't think could even be answered for our fellowship, honestly. What does recovery look like? How does that look?
Yeah. Well, all I can comment on is my recovery, I suppose, okay. Right? Because I think SMART focuses on helping individuals find out what would give them a meaningful and satisfying life. So for each person, you're going to have to identify what that is for you. And I really do believe that you can't sustain recovery without some sense of meaning and purpose. For me, doing this kind of work, like advocacy and recovery work, facilitating meetings, speaking and sharing my story, those kinds of things actually are part of the meaning and purpose of my life. And they're part of my recovery, really. Facilitating meetings is highly therapeutic for me. I don't sit up, SMART facilitators don't sit on a platform, or we generally do all our meetings in a circle. So, there's no obvious hierarchy. Facilitators, as a facilitator, I try to just say I'm at the same level as everyone in the room. I'm not, other than the fact that I took the training so I know how to facilitate, I haven't arrived anywhere in my recovery journey beyond the fact that, I'm here and still learning. And so what does recovery look like? Each person's going to honestly have to answer that for themselves. And I think that's really, really important, because a lot of times I do feel like people try and tell people what their recovery should look like. I'll go down this road. Is 90 meetings in 90 days absolutely necessary? Maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe it is. For me, I've never done that. And I can tell you right now, I would never do that. I would never have done it in a million years, only because my other life circumstances, with work and with family obligations and with other things that I had going on in my life, I don't think it would have been actually healthy for me to do 90 meetings in 90 days. It probably would have been counterproductive and burned me out and been a little bit too much. So I remember in treatment one time, you know how they make you come up with a relapse prevention plan, and you need to write it out. And I presented my relapse prevention plan to this counselor, and he was like, that's way too much, man. You can't do all that stuff. Like, it's not realistic.
Right.
And it was a real eye opener. It was like, I had this tremendous ambition, but that I was trying to write out for myself, but I needed the counsel to be like, okay, pace yourself. What do you want your recovery to look like? Are you doing too much? Are you not doing enough? Is there a lot of downtime? Boredom's a killer, especially in early recovery. We know that, right? So people need to find their own path for sure, and what it looks like for them. Absolutely.
So just in general, in a more generalized version, obviously it's going to look different on each individual, but how does the recovery process work in SMART? How would you say that process takes place? Like for 12 steps, it's easy. We say you work the fucking 12 steps, right? That's how it works. So what does that look like? I think I've seen some of the meetings, how people kind of interact and learn some tools during that. What else happens along with that? And can you expound on it a bit, please?
So SMART has 4 key areas that they would say are their 4-point program is what they actually call it. So building motivation and maintaining change, coping with urges to use, managing your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in an effective way without resorting to your addictive behaviors, and living a balanced, positive, and healthy life, whatever that might look like for you. And then, so as you mentioned, SMART has tools. That is basically what they call them. And their tools are, there's actually a SMART handbook. Look at that, SMART Recovery Handbook. And it's got all their tools in them. They can be worked out in any order, but basically they're frameworks for identifying belief structures, emotional stumbling blocks, triggers, things that are preventing you from maintaining your motivation in your recovery, and you can work through them. So I'll just give you an example of one of my favorite SMART tools. It's called Disputing Irrational Beliefs. They give all their tools acronyms. So DIBS, right? Disputing Irrational Beliefs. And basically it says, like, let's look at what you are actually thinking about a given situation or circumstance. And let's identify, let's step away from ourselves. Let's try and be as objective as possible here and identify if what you believe is rational or irrational. Because it's amazing when people start really taking a look at their thought processes, how many irrational thoughts they think and how many things they actually believe at a foundational core level that are untrue. So in the SMART guide gives some really fundamental and probably relevant examples. Like here's an irrational belief: I always fail. And that was one that I actually held because I really identified strongly as I am a failure. And I spent a lot of my time comparing myself to other people, comparing myself to peers, people that were in my kind of age bracket, my life stage. So like I'm in my early 40s now, but when I was in my early 30s and I was getting into recovery, and I would look at people that I knew that were married, that owned houses and that had happy families, and I would always compare myself to these individuals and say, look, I'm such a failure. I'm 15 years behind these people in life. If I had only got my act together when I was younger, I would own a house now and I would have this, my life would look this way. And so the irrational belief underneath all that was I am a failure, right? And so you have to question that. SMART would teach you to question that. Like, are you really a failure at everything? Right. Is everything you do you fail at? And so then you can be a little more objective and you can identify a couple things you do well, a couple things you're good at, a couple things you're actually really gifted in. And so it's about honesty in that sense. And you can spend a whole day paying attention to your thoughts, thinking about, are they true? Are they rational? Is this reality? And like another one for me was, I think this is pretty common to people with addiction, is that idea that, you know, when a really powerful craving would come on, you have this belief that you can't get rid of it unless you just give in to it. And it's like, and I would tell myself, oh, I'll just give in and then I can restart, right? Because then I'll get rid of the craving, like this emotion, because it's difficult. It's emotionally painful to like have this thing weighing on you, like driving you to want to use, and you wait 10 minutes and you wait half an hour and it's not going away. You wait an hour, or maybe you push through a day and it's still there. And it's like, okay, if I give into it, then I can get rid of it. Right? Is this rational? Is this true? Like what? So you got to step outside of yourself. SMART really encourages people to become self-aware. And I think that is something that is difficult in youth. I think it does get easier as people mature and grow. I mean, we know that substance use tends to stunt our emotional growth, right? So if you started using drugs when you were young, say in your teenage years, and then you finally arrive at a season of sobriety in your late 20s or early 30s, you really haven't matured emotionally much. And so learning to become self-aware is going to be a process that you need to go through, and SMART really helps with that.
Absolutely. I could definitely identify with it's funny and I've had this experience so far. Anytime I talk to someone from another recovery modality, they seem to share that they've found these answers or you know, ways of understanding themselves that I'm like, that's exactly the same shit I came to, right? That's the same conclusions I got that helped me live a healthy life today. Mm-hmm. And it's funny how we go different ways to get to that same understanding, or similar understandings. At least they might not be exactly the same, but I could identify a lot with what you just said. Well,
for most of us, our starting point is the same goal, right? I mean, for most people, if they're struggling with addiction, their goal is abstinence and a life that's free of that controlling substance. So how you get there, who cares?
Right.
Find your way, right?
Right. So our program, specifically ours at least, I think all 12-step programs might have a similar idea as this, but ours says that the promise is freedom from active addiction. Mm-hmm. Along with some other freedoms, hopefully, that you get. But that's the main promise right there, freedom from active addiction. Is there any such promise that SMART has about their program, that it provides anything?
I would say that their focus or their hope would be, I mean, in their language, it would be developing a more positive lifestyle. So, yeah. Developing a more positive lifestyle. And so, again, it really does leave it up to the individual to define that. And so, I mean, addiction is an interesting and complicated thing that a lot of people are discussing on the fringes now in terms of the way we define it, and recognizing some experts are recognizing that everybody's addicted to something. And that addiction in itself is not really a very helpful word. There is a psychologist in Europe that's actually prefers the word bonding, which I find very interesting, because he says, what are you bonding with? And then we can determine if our bonds are healthy or unhealthy. Just like the way Johan Hari, the journalist, has come up with that saying, you know, the opposite of addiction is connection. So because I actually use my time in addiction, I'll often say I was in a relationship with heroin. And because that's really what it was. I mean, my wife and people in my life would say, like we would call it my mistress, right? It was like, it's such a powerful relationship. And so if we think of addiction like bonding, you may be developing new, healthier addictions. Right. And not all addictions have the potential of killing us quickly, like a lot of substances will, or shortening our life or quality of life, or resulting in bankruptcy and other serious life altering problems. Many addictions could be beneficial. So, you know, I'm kind of in this new learning curve where I'm trying to figure out how we define all this stuff, because take, for example, we've had individuals that come to SMART recovery with a food addiction. They'll identify as having a food addiction, and you can't stop eating food.
Right.
So, you know, this is not something, so they have to come up with a way of measuring when their eating has become healthy. as opposed to problematic. And so that's a really interesting thing to navigate. And I think our understanding of addiction medically and as a society is going to continue to evolve.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You're right, because in talking to people that deal with like the sex addiction programs or the food addiction programs, and they have these what they call bottom lines or inner circles of behavior that constitute like a relapse for them, what they would call a relapse. And just trying to think of that in my terms, like I don't know that I can have a healthy relationship with heroin, right? Like I just don't know that exists. So it's definitely an interesting thing to look at.
But you probably figured that out through trial and error.
Oh yeah. Lots of it. Lots of experimentation for sure.
Yeah. So that you arrived at a conclusion that's true for you, and I think that same conclusion is true for me, and that's valid. Like no one can take that away from us. I'm never going to come to a point in time in my life where I'm like, well, I think heroin might be an okay option now. Like it's just out forever, right? So
yeah. So are there any signs, and this is another one where, there's no real way to tell if somebody in our fellowship was like on the verge of going downhill, but there's some kind of behavioral signs that we can see. I just didn't know if, since you're using more of a CBT method, if there's any signs that would indicate somebody is, really needs to take a look at themselves because they're headed in a possibly a bad direction, or the opposite, signs that, hey, I look for these in people, and that tells me that they are pretty strong in their current recovery.
So I have a good story for this from my own life, because I had a counselor that asked me to write out my next relapse, which sounds pretty morbid, but it was a really healthy experience in the sense that I had mentioned to you already that relapse was a real defining thing for my life. It felt like it just over and over and over again. And so the fear was, another relapse, right? That's what everyone that was close to me and loved me was afraid of. It's like, how do we know that he's really done with this? Like, there's been seasons of sobriety, 3 months, 6 months, a year and a half. And then he's gone back. So, everyone wants an assurance that it will never happen again. But I had this counselor that was like, write out your next relapse and tell me what leads up to it, because it's key. And I've already mentioned that there were studies that show that relapses typically are developing 2 to 3 months in advance of actually picking up the drug of choice. So that means there should be a lot of warning signs, right, leading up to that. So SMART doesn't really have anything super specific about helping identify these things. And of course, they're going to be unique to everyone. But I found a tool that this counselor gave me in conjunction with that assignment, writing out my next relapse, that really helped me identify vulnerabilities for me, areas that I needed to watch for that were signs that would come into play if I was heading back down that road. And so that tool is called the FASTER scale. You can Google it, people, FASTER scale. And it's also an acronym. FASTER scale each letter in the FASTER scale stands for something which leads to relapse. So the F is forgetting priorities. The A is for anxiety. S is for speeding up. T is for ticked off. E is for exhausted. And then R would be the actual physical relapse. And underneath each one of those letters is a whole series of potential behaviors or attitudes that could be developing in a person that would build off one another and then lead down that road. So when I wrote that assignment, I identified like key stressors for myself that would be things that I would need to watch for. Like finances, money was a huge one for me. I had a huge debt load as a result of my addiction, and bills coming due, and extra, like feeling tight financially was put me at a real risk of moving up in the FASTER scale. So just to give some examples of like things that are on that scale under forgetting priorities, like, are you starting to keep secrets? Are you finding yourself bored more than usual? Are you isolating more than usual? Are you developing obsessions in your relationships? Are you hiding money or procrastinating or lying? And, people, so this requires a level of real honesty if you're going to answer those things accurately. And you could actually find out where you're at on that scale And let's see if those behaviors are showing up for you, or which ones you would be most vulnerable to. And you would get an idea. So then you can reset. If you haven't picked up and used yet, you can get back. You don't have to keep going down that road, right? So if you find yourself somewhere on that scale, you can take measures to get into proper accountability, get in touch with loved ones, let them know where you're at, and reset yourself. And
that's interesting, because a lot of times I feel like we associate relapse with the inability to clearly see ourselves anymore. And so it would be like, I guess just from the perspective, and I'm not saying this is the right perspective, but just one that kind of has been given to me over time, is like, it's really hard to not be in denial during that relapse process. And so it would be really hard to answer that scale, honestly, I think.
So I agree with you. I hear what you're saying. And I suspect that might be further down the scale. Like if you're already getting into that denial mode, you may have allowed it to go too far already. Now, like if you're checking boxes off, I mean, I had a propensity for prepping for a relapse and hiding money or getting a stash, right? So if you see that box, hiding money, and you are hiding money, and you can't answer that honestly, then there might be a bigger problem here that I don't know if anyone can help you with. You might not be ready for recovery, like really, if you're at that point, because that's early in the scale, right? So if denial comes a little bit later, and then yes, I agree with you. I think if you've entered into that denial stage, reversing it is going to be much more difficult. And that's where I hope that you have established good accountability and people in your lives that are aware of your warning signs, that you have made yourself vulnerable to those people and told them your warning signs so that they can call you out on it. And that's the healthy connections that everyone in recovery needs in order to maintain their recovery.
To go back to one thing you said earlier, and I meant to ask this when you were telling me about how the program works, you learn these tools, which seem super valuable and kind of like the core of the program. Do you only learn them in the meetings, or are there other ways to learn them throughout the process? Is there like just skills classes or readings or?
So SMART leaves almost the entirety of an individual's recovery journey up to them. The meetings, the physical meetings or the online meetings, there are online meetings that people can participate in, are available, but outside of that, it's really up to the individual. They can purchase a handbook and work through it at their own pace. But SMART doesn't have any external offerings of counselors. They don't have a sponsorship system. They don't really emphasize or encourage relationships in any capacity. That's totally up to individuals. Like as far as how much socializing you do within a meeting or outside of a meeting with other participants is totally up to you. So yeah, there's not anything in that context for individuals. They've got to take ownership.
Now, with that handbook, is that meant to be gone through by yourself without anybody else?
It can totally be done by yourself. And like with anything recovery related, I would always say just do it as best you can. Like you don't have to do it good. You don't have to have all the right answers. You don't have to, like things change, right? We change our minds. You know, one of the early things in the recovery handbook is your hierarchy of values. And it's identifying the 5 things that are the most valuable to you in your life. Like, what do you value most, right? And for a lot of people, obviously in addiction, if they're truly honest with themselves, they put their substance at the top of that list, right? But if you're entering into recovery, you want to rearrange your hierarchy of values. And those probably change. I mean, maybe the first time you sit down and write those out, you come up with your 5 things that you find the most valuable. And I bet you if you're really going on a journey, in a year, those are going to be different. And in 2 or 3 years, they might be different again. And I think as people grow and mature, age in life, maybe those things will become a little more solid and rigid and not change quite as much. But
interesting that you mentioned not having, like the handbook can be done by yourself and the not having a formal version of sponsorship. Not that, I mean, honestly, the 12-step version of sponsorship isn't formal either, but it's just kind of implied. We just did our episode last week. We talked a lot about sponsorship and how that looks. We try to incorporate like how this looks for somebody new to recovery, but also what it would look like for somebody who's never been in recovery or had an addiction problem, in case they're listening, like maybe they could get a better understanding. And we sort of, I think, came to the conclusion, I know I'm monopolizing talking here, Billy, sorry. We came to the conclusion that like having a guide and or mentor figure in your life is pretty universal for every human. And so it's interesting that there's not one in SMART. I guess it's just kind of like an outside issue to them.
Well, I don't think SMART says like this is all you should do is SMART if you're going into recovery. Like just go to SMART meetings and you're good. Like I think that we always encourage people to pursue one-on-one counseling. I think it's really tremendously valuable and probably necessary. I don't think you're gonna, no matter how comfortable you might be feeling at a SMART meeting, I think some of the deeper traumas and emotional issues that people are facing are not going to come out in those settings. So yeah, while we don't have the formal sponsorship thing, I mean, I would be a person who says mentorship and accountability and counseling are very important elements of a person's recovery journey and probably absolutely necessary in early recovery.
Right.
And maybe you can revise that as time goes on.
Interesting. So I already know the answer to this next question, but we're going to ask it anyway. Is there a specific higher power, or do you have to follow a certain religion? Now, obviously, SMART does not identify with any of those. So I guess this question is more, is there a place for a higher power in your SMART program? Like, is it ever fit into the pool somewhere?
I think, yes. SMART intentionally distances themselves from religious and spiritual messaging, but they don't take a stance in any way, right? So individuals are free to have their belief systems, free to believe what they will and have faith. My faith, which I said I went on a journey, like I'm still a Christian. I still believe in the God of the Bible, and I still operate with that faith. It's different and evolving, and like I said, I kind of called it a bit of a wrestling match, in a sense, trying to figure all that out. And it plays a role in my recovery. It is important because of the things the Bible teaches. I feel are valuable lessons of wisdom that if people follow those guidelines, they can improve their lives and they can influence other people in a positive manner. And I mean, like even the AA's foundation on the four absolutes, right, of absolute honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. I mean, those are in essence spiritual biblical principles, right? So a lot of those SMART doesn't take a stance or position or even encourage faith in any way. Again, they give individuals that participate the freedom to incorporate whatever faith they would like into their recovery journey.
Awesome. Do they have any specific rules about what is clean or sober, or is that up for everybody's own interpretation?
They do. And I actually don't know them off the top of my head, but I know that they're on their website. Maybe I can find it. But in any case, one thing that I do know that they are okay with is what we call up here in Canada opioid agonist therapy, or I believe in the States it's referred to as MAT, medication-assisted therapy. So drugs like methadone and Suboxone people on them will be welcome to use them and participate in SMART meetings. And again, I think just based on the way SMART is structured and their principles, if that person wanted to call themselves fully in recovery or sober, that would be their prerogative. Like no one's going to tell them that they're not. And I think that that's valuable. I think that person has to find their journeys. You know, some people resign themselves to being on methadone for the rest of their lives. Other people are keen on tapering and getting off of it as soon as they can. But that process is complicated and not easy or smooth. So yeah, SMART is okay with people identifying where they're at in their recovery and how they would want to call themselves, or if they'd want to call themselves sober or abstinent.
Very
Yeah.
interesting. And I think one of the main things that I'm going to leave this conversation super curious about, not that we're quite done yet, but just the fact that SMART does kind of have a stance about using and a goal of, hopefully complete abstinence one day. And yet at the same time, it's not like this hardened goal that if you're not living up to that, you can't still be considered a full-fledged member or whatever you would want to call it. It's really interesting. It's kind of like a little ambiguous.
It is. I mean, they are abstinence oriented. I think that is their emphasis. But again, I mean, maybe we're being repetitive here now. Like, they recognize the journey for each individual and what it might take to get there. And so that's a process. Like, for instance, I mean, we haven't talked about smoking cigarettes, but I mean, that addiction is almost always attached to a lot of other substance use. And most people that do quit other drugs that still smoke wouldn't consider themselves, they would consider themselves sober still, right?
Yeah.
They would consider themselves abstinent. I still smoke cigarettes, but I'm still abstinent because I don't use the other drugs that were the major problem in my life, right? So it's a bit of a gray area for everyone. People need to find their own path. On that note, here's a bit of I'll leave you with this funny thought, because just on the idea of labels and people identifying as an addict or whatnot, I quit smoking as well. I know many people that have quit smoking cigarettes. I mean, people quit all the time. No one walks around 10 years after quitting smoking cigarettes and calls themselves a smoking addict.
True.
Right?
Very true.
So it's very strange to me. I mean, nicotine is widely considered one of the hardest drugs in the world to quit. People do say it's almost as difficult to quit nicotine as it is to quit heroin when they've had a long-term addiction to that drug. So and most people that do quit without help of 12-step groups or treatment programs or detox facilities. They arrive at a place in their life where they recognize the drug is not serving the purpose it used to, and that there's other more meaningful things that they would like to pursue, and that drug is interfering with. And so they eventually quit. And that might take a bunch of tries and a bunch of lapses, but most people that do want to quit smoking eventually do. And they don't walk around with labels.
Yeah, not there 5 years later, like, I'm a smoker named Jason. It doesn't really
A meeting.
right.
Everyone would scratch their head at that one. Yeah.
So, is there a type of person? And I know you described yourself, who SMART seemed to be the ideal kind of personality fit for you. So, is there generally a type of person that you personally believe is a good fit for SMART as opposed to a different place?
So I would say that if you're on a recovery journey, I would encourage a person to try every possible modality that they can get their hands on, just to find out what resonates with them. And that, don't be locked into anything. I think in Canada, we don't really do this. It's a difficult thing that I hear about in the States, where courts sentence people to the 12 steps. And that I've heard multiple stories about individuals wanting to do something else, wanting to do SMART recovery or wanting to go to a different program, and that not being an option for them. So that's disappointing, because we need to give people as many options as they want. And I think people should try as many things as they can. With that said, as SMART is a psychological approach with the cognitive behavioral therapy. So I would say that people that are more analytical, more that lean away from the spiritual solution would maybe be the ones that would benefit the most from SMART. But I mean, you'll never know till you try it. And we have plenty of people who participate in both. So that's also worth noting, right? They come to SMART, but they also go to AA or NA meetings at other times in the week, and they find them helpful. Like, if you find SMART helpful, it doesn't mean you find NA unhelpful. It just means, it's clicking for you on one level, and maybe that's clicking for you on another, or vice versa, right? So
that's super interesting. And you also bring up another question I wanted to ask. Do you guys sign court slips at all? Is that a thing?
We do sign slips for probation officers. So we have a couple probation officers where I live here in this area that will ask guys to go to SMART recovery, because that, for whatever reason, that officer's keen on it. I guess. Or maybe I think they probably give them an option, like go to a meeting, right? And Smart's one of the options. And so we'll sign those for them that they were there. Yeah.
So I'm sure you've heard of recovery housing. We have a crap ton of recovery housing down here. And a lot of times the recovery house will also have slips to be signed to prove you hit these meetings. Would you also be willing to sign recovery?
We would sign anything acknowledging if a person needed it for their accountability structure, whatever that looks like, whether it's a recovery house or a court system, we would participate in that for sure.
And you said there was no like rules about dating in the program. So anybody who's looking to get laid early on, go to Smart. Is there anything else? Now, obviously, we would say cognitive behavioral therapy is something else that is like Smart Recovery, but maybe even beyond that, is there any other program that's even remotely similar? And if there's not, what would be the differences between like a cognitive behavioral therapy with a counselor and what you would get in Smart?
So, cognitive behavioral therapy is very similar to dialectical behavioral therapy and then rational emotive behavioral therapy, which would be its precursor. So all those psychological approaches would have their similarities. The difference between whether you do one of those with a counselor and in the more meeting context of Smart would be probably the depth you can go on your personal issues and your comfortability with being vulnerable and open in a room as opposed to being one-on-one. So the principles are the same. How an individual would apply them into their life would be the same. The only difference would be probably the safety that a person might feel in the different environments.
And the cost, for sure.
And the cost. Yeah, no, I don't know how it is where you guys are, but we have some free counseling, substance use counseling available in Canada. So like in my city, people that live within this city can get one-on-one sessions with a counselor for free. So that is, and they can get cognitive behavioral therapy or even other approaches in that model, no cost.
Wow, we need more of that. You hear that, USA? What the fuck are we doing down here? We need more of this Canada stuff, man. That's great. Is there an end to your program or a graduation? Does that exist?
Does not exist. No end. The general encouragement to individuals is that they come as often and as long as they would like. So, you can come to as many meetings as you would like, as often as you would like for as long as you would like. If you feel that Smart needs to be part of your life for the rest of your life, then you should do that. And if you feel that you have got what you need from it and you're kind of done, then you can conclude that as well and be free to go. But yeah, in that sense, there's not a heck of a lot of emphasis on, like I already said, celebrating sobriety. There's no cakes. There's no there's no graduations, nothing like that. And I think it's got a value in that sense, in that it's just like, sorry, we're not getting too excited about this. It's your life. Like, make your life what you want it to be. And we're glad that you benefited from the program and what we offer. But, no one's going to stand on a chair and bake you a cake.
I liked all of that except no cake. I'm really sad about that.
We do have in the one meeting that I participate in, we have a baker. And she is great, and she brings in baked goods all the time. So
that'll make up for it then.
It's hard for the people with the food struggles.
Yeah, I imagine, right? You wouldn't have a meth lab person bringing in samples. So is there any, like, I don't want to just say hope, because I think there's always hope that we find this recovery and in our life purpose decide to give back some, but is there any principle of Smart Recovery of like, hey, even when you're done, maybe we'd love for you to still hang out and be, I guess not, because you don't have guides, right? Like, how does that?
Well, there is an encouragement to volunteer and even become a facilitator. And Smart there are a lot of meetings. It is all over the place, but it's not even, it doesn't even compare to how many NA and AA 12-step meetings exist around the world. So there's a lot of room to grow. So the encouragement would be that if you've really benefited and found this program valuable, that you would become a facilitator and maybe start a meeting in your neighborhood. So we need more, for sure.
Gotcha. What about dues? Is there any dues of any sort? How does SMART pay its way?
So most of the meetings are held in spaces that would be rented. So we do a pass the hat. We pass the hat around the room, and people throw in a loonie or a toonie or whatever they're able, or if they're not, that's fine too. And those would go towards just paying for the space. So there's no facilitators are not paid. There's no paid positions within the SMART organization, at least at the meeting level.
Right.
And so there's no nothing to worry about there. So mainly covering rent, which would also include we put coffee on, generally speaking, and that sort of thing would be all we need to collect some dollars for.
Awesome. Is there anything we didn't ask or I'm sorry, I should give you. Damn, I'm just forgetting you're here, Billy.
Okay.
Is there anything you wanted to ask?
Just during the meetings, would there be like a sharing session, or I mean, that's kind of all our meetings are.
We didn't. Yeah, we didn't really talk about what a meeting really looks like.
What would a
right?
meeting look like? Yeah.
Yeah. So I said we tend to sit in a circle, which is to avoid any hierarchy. But our meetings are loaded with crosstalk. So while we have an introduction and we read our opening statement, then we do a check-in. So we'll go around the room and we'll ask everyone to check in essentially how their last week has been, good, the bad, and the ugly, whatever they want to share, whatever they're comfortable with. If you're new to the meeting, then we clarify you don't even have to say anything. You don't have to participate if you don't want to. You're be free to observe. After the check-in, the facilitator will listen for cues, because oftentimes there's themes within a check-in. A lot of people were feeling the same way. You know how maybe a bunch of people are experiencing their first summer sober, and that comes with new triggers. Or Christmas season is around or approaching, and there's parties happening, and so the facilitator may bring that into a conversation, which will be in which crosstalk is permitted. So maybe an idea is put forth. We'll discuss people's thoughts, people's concerns. Or what are you going to do about all these parties your family is inviting you to, and there's going to be a lot of alcohol around this Christmas season? How are you going to handle that? What's your plan? And people will put out their ideas. People will put out what they've done, and so we'll have a very casual conversation in that sense. And then we will generally go through something from the workbook. So we'll photocopy a page, because not everyone's got a handbook, and hand that out, and then we'll read through it, discuss it, have an open crosstalk conversation about the tool. And at the end of the meeting, we do another round of checks out. What stood out for you? Did anything resonate with you? Did you find anything particularly helpful this meeting? Was it completely useless for you? And then, do that and then sign off till next time. So that's how a meeting looks. Yeah.
I'm surely glad nobody asked me if some of the NA meetings I've been to were completely useless for me, because I would have felt really bad saying yes. Is there anything we didn't ask that you feel like you want to talk about with SMART, or that you want to let people to know before they check it out, or if they're interested?
No, this was a really productive conversation. I really enjoyed chatting with you guys and talking about this. I always get my own thoughts clearer, when I have conversations like this. So that's great. SMART, if you're interested in more, you can find their official website at smartrecovery.org. There's also a find meeting button there, so you can hit that, pop in your zip code, postal code, and find a meeting near you. And I also mentioned online meetings, but everything you want to learn about SMART is there. So highly encourage people to check that out. And then just a note about myself, I do a lot of advocacy work, sharing my story, thought around recovery, and also in response to the ongoing overdose crisis, which we didn't get a chance to discuss, but is something that is very close to my heart in terms of my passion in mitigating the crisis, and then seeing what we should do as a nation in North America with our drug policy. And so if people are interested in those things and what's been happening in those areas, they can check my Facebook. I'm at DGA Snyder, DGA Snyder with a Y on Facebook, or my Twitter is at Daniel Snyder 1.
I did have a question. So our podcast sponsor is a local community organization, Voices of Hope, and they have sponsored or I don't know if you call it sponsored. They were hosting a SMART recovery meeting in this area. would you have any suggestions on how to promote that or get that out there, or how to kind of reach more people that may be looking for an alternative?
One way that it's been effective at people finding out about it in our community is the fact that our local community services organizations promote it and actually host a meeting. So Langley Community Services, where I live, they have a substance use counseling division, and they are 100% on board with smart recovery as a modality. So a meeting is hosted there. As a result, if you are someone in our community that's struggling with substance use, you're probably going to end up calling them at some point. So that's one reason people find out about it, because they are the place where you can get the free counseling or find other resources and whatnot. So I would encourage that meeting to obviously do what they can online, do the Facebook stuff and everything, but see what other organizations are doing recovery-related stuff, recovery houses, treatment centers, and things in the community that exist and have a following, and let them know about your meeting. Put up flyers over there, put up posters there, and try and draw people in that way. Meetings are a funny thing. Like, they go through their evolutions. They have 5 or 8 or 10 people, and then they go to 20. And we had 30 people, and we couldn't fit any more people in our room at one point, which becomes another problem, right? So you want your meeting to grow, but then you find you have a limit, right? And you need either another meeting or a bigger space. I find with smart meetings, because of the crosstalk format, about 15 people to 18 is like really max. It's really max. Like 12 to 15 is probably super ideal. And when you get to 20 or 25 people, the loud people do all the talking and the quiet people say nothing, right? Whereas if you're right in that wheelhouse of 12 to 15, then you can level the playing field and allow everybody an opportunity to speak. And a good facilitator knows how to tell certain people to stop talking and allow other people to talk, right?
That's interesting that you put it as high as 12 to 15. Just in studying, it sounds a lot like group therapy. I know it's technically not, because there's not a therapist in the room, but like the guru of group therapy, Yalom, suggests like 8 as a max, and it's hard to handle more than that. So 12 to 15, I'm like, good God, can you imagine having 15 people in a group? That's a lot.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that. So, I'm not going by any research on this one. I'm just going by experience with the room size. But, every meeting's somewhat different too. You definitely want people to feel comfortable to share. And I know, when it gets too big, the comfortability and the willingness to be vulnerable goes down.
Right.
So can I ask, are you in a crunch for time or anything?
No, not particularly. I have a poker game later tonight.
Well, and I tell you why, and I don't know, you might have to edit this out if you're not interested, but I am incredibly interested in like some of the more progressive things they've done in Canada.
Oh, sure.
Like Insight, the safe injection stuff, and I can't remember the name, but didn't they have the big hotel there in Vancouver where they were housing like for homeless and addicts and stuff? I read a book or actually listened to an audio book about it a few years ago, and
that's the Portland Hotel Society.
There you go. Yeah. So I haven't up with that stuff, but in our area, again, we have a local community organization that's pushing for a lot of those. We're I guess you would call it a pretty conservative area as far as the culture here.
Sure.
So they're not on board with like safe injection sites and things like that. So it's a local community organization pushing for some of those things. And just how they kind of played out in Canada.
So like I said, Canada is really progressive, BC in particular. And my opinions on harm reduction measures have come full circle too. So I was raised conservative, as I mentioned, and I actually would still probably lean conservative on, I would say I'm economically conservative, but because of our approach to drug issues, I'm really socially liberal on those things. And so I would be someone who is conservative but supports harm reduction and even decriminalization and even potentially the legalization of drugs. And one of the things, like Vancouver is the first city in the world to have a safe injection site. legally in sight. And now there's overdose prevention sites and safe consumption sites in many parts of the province and moving across Canada as well. Our harm reduction approach includes things like handing out needles, a very, very thorough naloxone program. So naloxone is widely distributed. It is free. It's easily available. Anybody can get it. You can get it from almost any pharmacy by just walking in and asking for it, and they will hand it to you. So those kinds of approaches, and like I said, my perspective on harm reduction came full circle in light of the overdose crisis and just the devastating number of deaths that we have. In British Columbia, a population of about 5 million people, the last 3 months, we've been losing as many as 6 people a day. So I don't know how that scales on a per 100,000 basis, but it's really high. Like, it's probably in North America, BC is one of the hardest hit areas. I think in the US, the Pennsylvania region might be one of the hardest hits. I'm not 100% sure. But so when I saw the number of people dying, and then recognized also for myself as an individual that had I been using with the drug supply is contaminated by fentanyl as it is now, when I was using, I might not be talking to you guys. I might not be alive, right? So we have a highly toxic drug supply, and we need to do something about it. You cannot help a person in recovery if they're not alive. So that was the shift point for me on harm reduction. It was like the argument is always about tough love versus enabling, as if it's like this black and white thing. Like, you're the loved one with your family member, and your loved one is struggling with an addiction, and you're either enabling them or you're cutting them off. You're operating in tough love. And like the TV show Intervention, which I have a real problem with, because I find that it does more harm than good. And studies have been done on that method of intervention, the method in which you blindside the person. You sit them down and say, if you don't go to treatment today, we're cutting you out of our lives. We're not even going to talk to you anymore until you make a change. And you're taking an individual who's already disconnected from society. They're disconnected from themselves. They're disconnected from their family. They've burned bridges. And then you are going to tell them, you're going to threaten them with more disconnection if they don't do what you want them to do. And somehow we're surprised when they run down the street as far and as fast away as they can, right? So that method of intervention is clearly ineffective. So my thinking on harm reduction is, let's keep people alive. Let's get them naloxone. Here's a program that we've embarked on in British Columbia. It's called Safe Supply. So we recognize how toxic the drug supply is, and we recognize we have extremely vulnerable individuals who are very precariously housed and are high risk of overdose. And they are using such a toxic drug supply that their risk of overdose and COVID-19 is through the roof. We need to do something to mitigate this. Let's give them prescription grade substances of their choice that are clean, not contaminated by fentanyl, and will at least prevent them from being at the same level of risk of overdose. Now, there's a lot of controversy around this. It's a bit messy. It's not been rolled out properly. Most doctors are not totally on board with it. It's not something like, when you try and make broad policy changes like this and implement them kind of in a provincial manner, like the state at the state level, as opposed to coming in from the federal level, it's going to be messy, and they're not going to roll out very smoothly. But it is something we're attempting to do. It does at least mitigate the toxic drug supply in some respect. And all these places, the needle exchanges, the overdose prevention sites, the doctors that they see for Safe Supply, they become connection points for individuals who are disconnected. You have to go there. You have to see these people, and hopefully the workers there recognize that they have a role to play in which they can be a voice of reason, hope, influence, a positive encouragement, someone that shares with that person that they have value, that they have potential, that there's more to them than the life that they're currently living, that change is possible. And yet at the same time, we're accepting you where you're at, and we're recognizing that this is a process and it's a journey. I mean, if you're someone like myself who was addicted to heroin, you might recognize the amount of time you invest in the hustle to make sure you have enough drugs and avoid withdrawal. And like that is a time consuming That's more than a full-time job, right? Like it is. And if you're homeless and needing to come up with the money, like I maintained my housing and employment throughout my addiction, and most of my drug money came from credit cards, which was a major overwhelming debt and resulted in an eventual bankruptcy. But if you're homeless and you don't have a job and you're spending all day, you're spending 20 hours a day trying to come up with enough money to maintain your opioid addiction. And so if you can meet that person where they're at and take the need for that hustle out by providing them with a safe supply, the world opens up to them in a sense. They're now connecting with people in a healthy regard. They don't have to they have free time to maybe get a shower or pursue housing or, take care of themselves in some other capacity. So I think the argument for harm reduction should not be a conservative versus liberal argument. I think it should be an economic and compassion argument. If you can't win the conservatives over with the compassion angle, you could probably win them over with the economic angle. And a lot of these programs save taxpayer money in the end, right? The drain on the system, criminalizing individuals, break and enter, the justice response, the police, the first responders responding to overdoses, the drain on the financial drain on the taxpayer is huge. And when you do housing first policies and you put people into treatment or give them the option, you make sure that they're not at the high level of risk for overdose, you actually decrease the costs on society. And so there are some surprising studies done on how much money that actually saves. And so we need to, the drug wars failed. People will always use drugs. We're never going to get away. If there are still conservatives out there somewhere that believe in some kind of utopia where all drugs will be gone one day and all addiction will be gone, like they are so deluded, they're probably unreachable. Like
they're all getting drunk at night thinking that.
And we're in a culture right now in this county where we're probably about 30 years behind the actual time. So we're probably like...
Yeah. There's a lot of organizations and work being done to change drug policy. We just legalized cannabis. It wasn't rolled out very well. The black market for marijuana is still thriving in Canada because the government marijuana is too expensive. So they gotta work on that. They got to do something about that. But fentanyl is not going to go away just because of the DEA does a really good job stopping it at the border. It's just not going to happen. And with the number of people dying, we need to take a different approach to drug policy. We really do.
I can't tell you how severely disappointing it is when I just agree with everything you fucking said and I can't argue with you. It's like, God, I can't even, there's no fun in this.
That's too bad.
It is good to have people advocating for positive change.
Yeah.
And so we've seen a huge impact with COVID, I guess, has really impacted our overdose rates. Like in the last 3 months in this county, we've seen a huge, increase in overdoses.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen the same thing in Canada. They have similar lockdowns to kind of what's going on in the States.
Yes, well, we did. We were locked down here, kind of quarantined for quite a while. But yeah, our overdose numbers are up as a result of COVID. And I think there's a couple key reasons for that. I think the first would correlate with what's been identified as deaths of despair. So in the States, for sure, the increase in opioid overdose deaths, depression, anxiety, and suicide, they've been kind of identified as deaths of despair. And so what's underneath that? Because it's not just about drug use. It's about people's sense of meaning, their beliefs in life, perhaps the destruction of the nuclear family in some capacity, moving away from the move away from Christian values, I think, has perhaps something to do with it. I mean, America was founded on those principles and they are pushing hard against them. And people, if we step back from the picture and we don't just look at individuals and their journey, but we look at the broad story of what's happening in America, it seems like the culture is eroding because people are losing out on, I'm Canadian, so you can take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt here, guys. I'm not sitting up here in Canada judging the Americans by any means, but it just seems, I mean, we're experiencing it too in a smaller capacity. So, why are people so depressed? Like, drug use actually is down. Youth especially are using less drugs than they were 20 years ago. Yet anxiety and suicide and depression are way, way up. 1 in 5 Americans are prescribed some sort of prescription drug. I think 1 in 5 are on antidepressants or sleeping medication. So like that is 35. What is that? I don't know how many people down there. It's a lot of people, right? Yeah.
300 million.
It's like 70 million people, right, are on medications, and then more than that, of course, too. So, so that, this is a difficult topic to talk about, because now I'm getting into territory where I have no ideas about solutions. None, right? None. I don't know what you do about a nation that's depressed and anxious.
Well, one thing I say, with all the progressive movements you seem to have up in your area, what's the climate like?
Weather?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we might want to move there.
Well, the weather may be one problem. One reason we have such a homelessness problem in Vancouver. I mean, it's where everyone perhaps ends up in Canada, because you would gravitate towards the West Coast because it's the most mild climate. And within an hour's drive of where I am, I have the ocean, and I have skiing on mountains, and I have beautiful lakes, and the climate is mild. Today it was 30 degrees. The sun is shining. So it's beautiful. Our winters, we sometimes get a little bit of snow. So it's pretty nice here.
We don't know what the fuck 30 degrees is. That's Celsius.
Oh, right. Sorry.
For us, it's freezing.
You'll have to do a conversion on that. I don't know what 30 degrees converts to Fahrenheit.
Sounds good. It's probably 72 and sunny. It's probably beautiful.
Yeah.
That's great, man. So one last thing, you had pointed me towards a blog you had written at one point. Was that like a guest blog, or was that on one of your sites? Or
yeah, it's about it's a site that I don't do a whole lot with, but yeah, I'm maintaining it. Maybe I'll pour a little more energy into it in the coming days. But it's mindfulhope.com. And I enjoy writing, and I enjoy writing about my story and my experiences, and just the way I see recovery and drug policy. So I put a lot of my writing up there, and also on my Facebook.
Okay, yeah, I remember you said your Facebook and your Twitter account to look you up, and I didn't want to leave out the blog if that was something you were interested in.
Yeah, Mindful Hope.
Mindful Hope. Excellent. Well, it's so nice that you came out here tonight, Daniel. I've definitely learned some stuff about smart recovery that I didn't know. And it's been engaging talking to you, honestly, about all kinds of different stuff. I wish we just had more to argue about. I love your brain.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm sorry we didn't disagree a little more.
I know, right? But no.
I love this too, because it seems like every time we do one of these with someone who's doing a different recovery modality, I'm like, I'm going to start going there now. Like, I'm going to check that out for a while.
The only time I'm going to have a problem with another modality is when they say it's the only way.
Yeah.
Right. And, because that's just clearly untrue, right? There's lots of paths. So. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for coming out. Hopefully our paths will cross again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yes, absolutely. Take care, guys. Thanks. Have a great night.
All right. Good night.
See ya.
Oh, good. Whew.
Hot. Yeah. Well, then he brought up that insight in that Portland hotel. That's all that book I listened to. I can't remember what it's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. That's what it was called. I just thought about it. Yeah. It was about a doctor that worked in that Portland hotel, and they had an old hotel, and they opened it up to homeless people and whatever. And just, if you need a place to live, you can come live here. And they provided them free, like, mental health, physical health.
They get free mental health for drug addiction.
Well, that was not through the state. So the Portland hotel thing was like independently funded. It wasn't like state funded. It was an independent organization.
Independently funded like that, like
donations and charities and churches and all that.
Who's donating to that? Who's like, oh man, we need to pour millions into this drug epidemic? That sounds crazy.
As he said, the thing was in Portland, in Vancouver, it was just this huge homeless problem. They have a tremendous homeless problem there. And to where like a whole section of their downtown area is just fucking overrun with homeless. Probably like similar to what you see. I don't know if you've seen some of the pictures in like LA and You know how LA is getting now in some of those places. It's similar to that. It's like whole sections of the city, like businesses and shit down there, like we can't even open because. So anyway, they came up with this Portland Hotel Authority, and then I think they had to shut it down, or they, because they did have a hard time keeping up with money, and they had a hard time keeping up like health standards and things because you have a bunch of mentally ill and homeless people that have all sorts of issues and aren't clean and drugs and like I mean you're inviting in all those people to live there, but they can live there, stay, and come and go as they please and get mental health and dental health and physical health, doctors.
Right. So one of the things I had thought about even before we did an extremely long time on this podcast was that maybe we should do our recap as a second episode. And I don't know. We've gone back and forth on this idea from the beginning of like, should we break it into 2 episodes, blah, blah, blah. And I only say that because like for today, we can't go any longer. That was like an hour and a half.
Yeah, it was an hour and a half. Yeah.
So, but maybe if we always, like, I feel like people do complain that, oh, they took half an hour to get into the subject matter. Well, I think it's a little different for us because our subject matter is still our subject matter, even when it is the recap. But maybe if the recap was its own separate half an hour, and then the shows were more like an hour and 10, hour and a half in this case.
Yeah, or and I know that can get hard. I don't want to pigeonhole us into strictly, but if we said, all right, we'll do the show be an hour and a half, and the first half hour is the recap, and then we give an hour to whatever the subject is.
Well, I feel like that's what we usually do, close to it, and I try to keep us on it. We have gone over that hour and a half the last couple episodes by a little.
What I was gonna say. I guess it's getting hard because then we get to talking, and you don't want to go.
Well, like, but with one like this, like, and see, this is where it doesn't make any sense though, because it would be you release your main episode Sunday, like we've been doing, but then you release your recap like Wednesday or Thursday. But it's the recap from the week before. Like we've already had another episode. So it almost doesn't make sense to have, unless you just release them both Sunday, but that's fucking weird too. Then the other thought that really occurred to me, and I hate this idea because I'm right now it's all about like, hey, listen if it's convenient for you. But like people have talked about having a donation way. What's the thing that people do?
Oh yeah,
you know what I'm talking about.
Pay money.
And then they have like the extra material.
Yeah, right.
What the fuck is that called?
Patreon.
Yes. And I'm like, well, we could have the recap episodes on Patreon or behind the whatever. And I'm like, it fucking feels weird. I don't know why.
I mean, see, and I go to like, I don't fucking care if it's 3 hours. We can do a recap and a 2-hour episode. But that's the way I listen to podcasts.
Right.
I don't care about length of time. But that's me.
Well, and so, I mean, and then it gets into, are we doing this because this is what we enjoy doing, which is generally what we've been doing so far? Are we doing this because we want it to take off, which is, I don't think the way to go about it.
Yeah, I don't either.
We do it because it's what we like, and then it doesn't matter if it takes off because we like it. I'm down with that to some extent, but I also
really like doing the recaps.
I think it's relevant material usually. It's usually something I'm like, oh man, that was a good idea.
I at first I was like, yeah, we don't need to do recaps, but then since we've been doing them, I kind of like that. I think it's good.
Yeah, I like it too. I don't know. I just don't know how to do it. I mean, would anybody give a fuck that we did it? Like, we would still record it on Sundays if we just put it out on Thursday as a separate thing. Like, hey, it's the recap from the. That would be, I don't know. I think.
Yeah, that might.
How do you label it? Like,
all right,
episode 39 and a half.
Well, you'd almost have to do it by title. Like this one will be sponsorship recap.
Right. But then I'd be so confused if I was the one listening to the fucking podcast. I don't think it's going to work. I think we just do a recap. If people want to stop listening, they stop listening. I've looked at I don't know the statistics across the board, but it's depressing when you go back and you do look at any one episode statistics, and it's like it only shows you for the Spotify. Like iTunes is completely different. I think that's where more of our more thorough listeners are at. I don't really know that for sure, but I'm hoping. But like the Spotify stats on any given episode, it's like, hey, for the first 25 minutes, people listen, and then half of those drop off, and then at the hour mark, half of those drop off, and it's just like people ain't really listening for an hour and a half anyway.
Well, it depends on what you mean by drop off. Like say, because me, I listen to lots of long podcasts that I never listen to the whole thing at one time. You know what I mean? So I don't know what it means by drop off, but there's a lot of them where my drive to work is 20 minutes. So
right.
The 20 minutes when I get to work, I turn it off. And when I come back in the car, I turn it back on and go, and listen to the next 20 minutes on the ride home. So
and I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how it counts for that either. And Spotify is known for being really weird about its rankings and numbers and shit. Like people have really put that question to that. Like they don't even have show notes on Spotify yet. I'm like, that's kind of important, isn't it? To tell you what the fuck it's about.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess we'll do the recap stuff. Pull this up and get it on, and then we'll edit all this bullshit in the middle out for the podcast part. Let's see, what do we got here? We got to pull up. Damn, I should probably stop this and fuck it. It's easier this way. We'll just do it looking at the screen. That's fucking weird. We got to stop that, don't we? And then like move our chairs and look at each other.
What?
Or just look at each other.
For the recap?
Yeah. There's a lot of moving shit.
Oh, yeah. I would just do it just like this.
Okay. Need to do a waiver. At some point, you need to talk to Jen about re-recording the voices ad.
Yes. I'll ask her that today.
So there wasn't a whole lot to recap.
She'll be in bed by the time we get home.
You think? Will she be home?
We were supposed to start early.
Let's go to the saved stuff.
I'm going to be up half the night because of course I say I keep yawning.
I had a nap and drank a coffee late today.
I drank a coffee right before I came here. I did take a nap too.
Oh shit, that's not what I want to do. View original post. Let's do that. So there really isn't all that much to recap, honestly, just a few things. So it shouldn't be bad to pull up and talk about it real quick. Okay. Those two things.
I was trying to look up clean and smart recovery when he was talking.
Did you find anything? Ready? I don't know why that's still open. We're still recording? Yeah, good. Do we need that?
Oh, no.
I don't think so. It'd be fine.
Can we unplug it from here? Or doesn't matter?
It doesn't matter.
Well, we'll be able to hear each other, huh?
Yeah. So what are we gonna do here? I feel like it's too close. It's up on me.
So we did a weird thing though.
What?
Normally we would do our introduction and then do the recap, but we did an introduction with him.
Right. So I guess we'll just have to find a segue real quick. And I'll probably just throw one of those stupid little 3-second jingles or something in between so that people know time elapsed. It's convenient. Okay, we'll do it like this. So that was a great conversation with Daniel about smart recovery. We do want to, we usually do our recap at the beginning of the episode. We're going to do it here at the end just to cover some of the things people had to say about sponsorship and thoughts. One of the things our friend Stephanie, who messages us frequently during the week, I was talking with her and she shared a lot of her personal struggles. I'm not going to get into too much of that. It's a little bit of a personal matter, but just her experiences with 12-step and how she put her sponsors on a pedestal early on because of the way she felt internally and, how that worked out. And made the sponsee relationship pretty murky, and just the whole dynamics of it got weird, and what she was looking for out of it might not have been really what we talk about, what we're hoping to look for out of it. And I think what I got out of that was that, it was a pretty good thing to explore sponsorship, and maybe not that there's any definition of what it's supposed to be, but just some general ideas of like, hey, this is what a healthy sponsorship relationship probably resembles, and because I think kind of like what he said, what Daniel was talking about was smart. Like, I think a lot of people come in and they hit a meeting or two in the wrong town or with the wrong personality, and they just get a really sour ass taste of what NA is supposed to be. That is not what I believe NA is at all.
Right. And he did bring up some important points about, sort of not as much the sponsorship, but like some of the aspects of shame and things like that, that I thought, yeah, we absolutely do those things. And I have not directly, I would say indirectly, I've tried to do some things in my personal program to shy away from that. Things like, when people ask me to sponsor them, I say, this is your journey. This is not, I'm just helping to kind of steer you along your path. This is your journey and your work. It's not about me and what I have to give you,
Right.
And things like that. I think that's, for me personally, it's important, but I think it's important for the individual to take some responsibility for their recovery.
It's absolutely about me and what I'm going to give you if I'm sponsoring you. I'm kidding. Oh my God. You know, it was hilarious. If anybody watches the YouTube video, watch Daniel give his hand motions for the tug of war. That was great. That was like, man, if I do some video editing, that is not going to look like tug of war. But no, I definitely appreciated Stephanie's feedback. We also had, so it was weird. We posted this on Facebook, and Facebook's been acting really fucking stupid this week about like not being able to find posts or notifications or this, that, and the other. So the one place that we posted it, I had some conversations through comments with people about sponsorship, completely disappeared. And I even messaged like the person I know that is the group moderator or whatever, and was like, did y'all remove this? Did we do something wrong? Like, not in a mean way, but just I'd like to follow the group's rules. And they weren't aware that we had done anything or that it had been removed, but I could not find it for the life of me.
Yeah, and I've had that issue with Facebook too. I think we've talked about that at times. Like, I know, like, you've made posts and I've been tagged in them, and I will go read the comments and stuff, and then all of a sudden I can't find the posts anymore. Like, where did that go?
Yeah.
Why is that not in my feed? And I try to do the things you're supposed to do with a like or an interact with the post so that it keeps it kind of relevant in my feed. So I've had some Facebook issues.
Yeah, for some reason I never remember to save or bookmark, or I like once in a while I do, and then most of the time I don't. So we lost some things. I'm sure what they had to say was beautiful about sponsorship. Think of the most beautiful thing you can think about sponsorship, and that is what our listeners had to say about it, for sure. On the other place we put it on Facebook, though, Maximilian said, I used to tell people that they had a favorite drug dealer, someone who showed them how to use. So if they wanted to stay clean, they needed a hope dealer, aka a sponsor, something to that effect. I thought that was kind of interesting because, I kind of agree with that, even though it's a little, I don't want to say it's a little ridiculous, but it's a little strange to, compare it to, when you were using. But yeah, somebody had to show me the ropes. I didn't just pick up a needle at Safeway and buy a pack of them and say, you know what, I bet I can figure out how to squirt some water on this spoon with it. And like, we didn't have the internet really when I was doing that and learning that. Yeah, so I needed somebody to show me the ropes. I couldn't. Are there even videos? I hope there's not fucking do-it-yourself videos of this shit on YouTube. I'm scared now.
I haven't looked.
But yeah, we needed somebody to guide us and mentor us, even in terrible things. So why wouldn't that apply to us now?
Right.
And then if you go over on Twitter, ACOA Tom said, I think step 5 specifically calls for admitting to another human being because we'd be tempted to admit it to the dog or the plants. It takes a relationship with a sponsor to help us make it to step 12 and the spiritual awakening that is waiting. It's a beautiful cycle of love. Wasn't completely sure what he was going for there, but I think the inclusion of another person and maybe that love in the sense of acceptance for the first time that we feel from sharing our souls with somebody, and they don't like deny us or whatever. I think that was my big fear for a lot of my life, was that I was going to bare my soul to someone and they were going to know who I really was. And then they were just going to reject the shit out of me for being that.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what he was talking about. I hope. Maybe I'm putting words in his mouth. And then David said, always make sure your sponsor has a sponsor. Make sure they're working the program. Make sure you can identify with them. I think they're all pretty key points. My idea of whether my sponsor needs to have a sponsor anymore is changing. Not that I don't think they don't. I think they need to be in recovery and learning and still open-minded and growing. I don't know. I'm getting a little iffy on the sponsorship thing now.
Yeah, it's so one of the things I get my experience with sponsors is that at the time that they were sponsoring me, they had all those things, but they don't have those things now in their life 15 years later. You know, my first sponsor that I shared my first 5th step with used, you know,
Right.
So when I shared that 5th step with him, he had all these values and principles and all these things that I admired, but probably not since. So, you know,
Right.
So I don't know. I don't know why that's that relevant. I guess if you're going to trust in the process, I think for me, the process of having a sponsor and sharing this stuff with them and all that is really about me getting to be okay with me, not necessarily about me trusting this other person.
I guess I think a lot of our hardcore holding on to everyone needs a sponsor, this, that, and the other. And I'm not disagreeing with that idea. Like, I think if I'm my own sponsor, I'm in trouble.
Right.
I do think that, right? So it's not like I want to say, oh, I have the answers. I think we fall into this belief, kind of like we talked about with Daniel a little bit, where we tend to believe we have the only right way, right? Maybe NA was the only right way that worked for me, but I don't think it's the only way. And we can say, hey, everybody that goes out, I end up seeing most of them come back here if they ever make it back. That's a little biased, because the ones who don't ever use again or don't have problems with their using,
don't come back.
Yeah, they don't need to come back, right? Like, so I do know people who have left 12-step programs and
they just
use in a way, and they're still on my Facebook feed and living happy 15 years later. Like, I mean, am I still waiting for the ball to drop on them? I doubt it. Like, It doesn't seem like it at this point.
Yeah, and I can say, my first sponsor that left, I still keep in touch with him. His life's not a complete train wreck of a disaster,
right?
Right. But he's not in NA anymore, and then definitely there was a time where his life was a complete train wreck disaster because of using. And he came to NA and got some years of recovery and got some stability in his life, and went back to using and didn't come back here, and found some other, I don't know what his process was for getting to where he is now, but
it's just interesting. So yeah, I don't want to say your sponsor shouldn't have a sponsor. I just think the important part of that is that we're teachable and we have teachers available.
Yeah, and I don't think we talked about this in our sponsorship episode, but I think I noticed it. We talked about it in the lead up to that episode. Is in a lot of the AA literature I read, it made it seem like sponsors were just for new people. And that old timers didn't have sponsors. And when I talked to someone who was familiar with AA, they actually said, yeah, I think when you've been around a while, you don't really have a sponsor anymore by name. Now, this is just one person's limited experience take with that. I can't say that that's 100% true.
Right.
Not speaking for a fellowship that I don't even go to.
Oh, fuck it. Let's speak for him.
The idea would be that, if I have a regular meeting that I attend and a regular support group or a regular, foundation of people in my network that are other people that are in recovery, do I need a sponsor per se?
Right. Right.
As long as I still have powers, greater than me or powers outside of myself that I'm accountable to, or almost some of those principles Daniel talked about, if I'm accountable to these people, if I'm open-minded to suggestions, if I'm keeping in touch and being open with them about what's going on in my life, do I really need that quote unquote sponsor label on someone.
And I think that's where we in NA, I'm going to include myself, not that I believe it, but I will, I'm part of our fall too. If somebody said they didn't have a sponsor, or that their sponsor didn't have a sponsor and they didn't give a fuck, I'd judge them.
Yeah.
Because I would assume that meant their
doing
ego was so big that they didn't need anybody to tell them anything anymore. They had already figured it all out. They had all the answers. When that really doesn't necessarily have to be true. It could just be that, look, I use these 6 guys in my life. I run shit past them. They all help me with stuff, like super teachable, because I obviously don't have the fucking answers, but I just don't have a sponsor in name, right? Like, it's not one person that I go to.
Right.
That's not necessarily a terrible thing. It sounds like you're in a great spot in recovering.
Right. Or I'm just doing 10, 11, 12 for a while in my life. I'm in this process,
Yeah,
I have a home
really
group, I have a service commitment, I'm doing these other things. As long as you're doing those other things. I mean, now if that starts to sort of wind backwards where like I don't have a service commitment and I don't really have a home group and I'm not really doing these things and I don't have a sponsor, then it sounds bad.
Right. We had to answer that. What was that, faster scale or whatever? Yeah. Yep, I'm hoarding money in line to people about it. I'm like, I want to do that every day. And then the last comment on our Twitter was Anna Anonymous said, brutal honesty with her sponsor was what helped. She can't allow herself to hold anything back for fear of shame or embarrassment or anything. She said she's sometimes discerning in meetings about what she can share depending on who's in the room. But with her sponsor, she doesn't want to have that luxury. And that's been one of the most beneficial things. And I think, all the stuff Daniel talked about that Smart Recovery does is all stuff that I found in our program, thank God, because it's all very useful. But the elimination of shame, right? That was one of those things I found, not elimination, but the process to deal with a whole lot of it that I had and not carry it like I used to. And I think that's what she's referring to, is the ability to really talk about some of that shit that we were taking to the graves before we got here. Like, nobody was ever going to know this embarrassing, awful part of my life. And then we get to talk about it and not have it rule us anymore.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot to be said for, I forget how he described it, but he talked about that insane thinking that we have, and like I always call that my addiction. I don't know. I forget what he called it. The absolute statements when it was dibs.
Oh, yeah.
So that line of thinking, all I could think is, that's what I always just call my addiction. Like all the, things that I say that totally aren't true that I'll tell myself. I think some of these shameful things that I have are exactly like that. They're irrational thoughts that I tell myself, like, oh, this is the worst thing that could ever possibly happen. And it feels that way inside of my head. But then when I say it out loud, it's like, it's really not that bad compared to like a Jeffrey Dahmer who fucking rapes people and eats their hearts, like is it really the worst thing in the world that I stole drugs from my mother? Like, is that really?
No, I get you. And I've seen the actual thing he's talking about in some therapy workbooks where it's like, you list, you say the core belief is I'm a failure. Well, have you done anything that didn't fail? Well, yeah, I made a fucking peanut butter and jelly sandwich yesterday for lunch and I ate it, right? Like, we start to see that it's just not a true statement anymore. And another acronym they use a lot of times is ANTS, for automatic negative thoughts. Like, a lot of us just tend to have that snap negative thought about everything. And I would say I am definitely one of those people that always has a negative thought first. Like, it's always about how the world's out to get me, or about how poor me, or like that's the first thing that comes to my mind. Anything that happens,
whatever's happening to me is the worst.
Yes,
nobody has it this bad. Like, all that shit.
Everything, and even the ways I just think about things. My therapist loves to point it out. She's like, "There you go again, talking about how everything's bad." She's like, "Maybe it just is. Why does it have to be so terrible?" But that was mostly all we had. We're as always, we share our memes. Now on Facebook, like we do on Instagram. So there's just all kind of brutal and savage, awful pictures that are supposed to be funny in some way, shape, or form. Hopefully you don't get too offended by them. I'm trying to find more groups to share them in because they're always fun to laugh at for me. And then I did want to mention a friend of mine, Stephanie, a different Stephanie. It's an episode of Stephanie's. Did our logo for us, and she does graphic design, and so she did the new. I'm sure you saw it. We didn't talk about it. Yeah, yes, I fucking love it. It's beautiful. The puzzle piece and the Maryland flag in it, which is absolutely awesome looking right now. And then, she is supposedly working on doctoring up some other stuff for us to use in other places. And I just incredibly thankful to her for doing that.
Yes,
I think what she's done is
awesome.
Yeah, it's beautiful looking. I was so excited. She actually wants to like switch it up a little bit and go a different direction. And I'm like, I already put it everywhere because it's great. But no, I can't wait. I think I just want to be able to plug her graphic design, business, I guess. I don't even know if she has a business just yet, but she's kind of getting into it, and apparently from what I've seen, it's really, really good. So
we gotta make some bumper stickers and sweaters and hats.
Fuck yeah, that's what I'm ready to ask her if she knows how to like fucking do websites and shit, because I'm just tired of technology. Is getting to be too much. I spend a lot of time. Like, God, if I ever go back to work, I'll never be able to keep up with this shit.
Maybe if we get over 150 regular listeners, we get a production person.
Yeah, we'll hire an assistant.
We'll hire him as an intern. That means you don't have to pay him.
Maybe we can get an audio intern from a college or something. No, I doubt it. Anyway, yeah. So Stephanie, thank you, and
they got all kinds of interns.
There you go. Thank you for that, and I can't wait to put your name of your entrepreneurship out there as soon as we know some more about all that. Beyond that, I don't have anything left to talk about. It's late at night on a fucking Saturday. I'm ready to go to bed. And
yeah, me too.
Awesome. So everybody stay safe out there. I will hate Billy tomorrow when we're trying to edit all this. But stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you again next week.